specification. 39 times JAXPORT followed the contract with Hal Jones in this matter with regard to change orders, and once they didn't. And we would like them this time to be consistent and to follow the terms of the contract on this particular change order. Thank you. I apologize for going over on my time.
Thank you. Mr. Feltel, in fairness to the process, and if Mr. Bashir did go over, we hope that neither party feels disadvantaged, and in good faith allow him to continue. If you so choose to use additional time, I think opposing counsel would agree that that would be fair.
Absolutely.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
Please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Falconet.
Yes, sir.
I will do my best to stay within my allotted time.
I think we're all good. This is obviously an important matter. We want to have all consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. I would just offer up first that you will note from my PowerPoint presentation that I assumed colors and fancy transitions were not part of the cost containment exercise, and so this is going to be a very vanilla presentation. I want to address something up on the front end, though, that Mr. Bashir said. He said that the only way to change lump sum work is by change order. And through the course of this, you're going to see that that's actually not correct, that there are two ways that you can address things in the contract. One is by change order, and I think Mr. Bashir did a good job of explaining the various ways that a change order price amount can be reached. But the second way is actually, and this is something that is in, I believe, all of JAXPORT's construction contracts, and we'll get to that specific language in the general covenants of JAXPORT as referenced by Mr. Green in his letter. So, I've already read you the dispute resolution language. I will not belabor that further. We're certainly well aware of the process that we're going through. Now, at the end of Mr. Bashir's presentation, he spoke at length about fairness. And I want to just mention a couple of things that I think are important in determining whether or not that this was a fair process. This is the supplemental instructions to bidders. This is what was provided to the contractors as they were making their bid determinations. And what it says here is that the bidders advised before submitting a bid to visit the site of the proposed work and become familiar with the nature and extent of the work and any local conditions that may in any manner affect the work to be done, etc. And it says the bidder is to carefully examine the drawings, specifications, and contract forms to be informed about conditions and requirements contained therein. So, as part of the bid process, we tried to make sure everybody was looking at this, and here's, I think, also a critical item. This is a note for size purposes. I didn't pull off the entire detail, but specific to work item number 10, which is this outfall at 1552, the contractor is instructed to verify existing field conditions for that outfall, but for bid purposes, assume outfall is a 60-inch pipe with an inverted elevation at negative 14.5, so 14.5 feet below the water line. And I mention these only to say that this was not something that it was understood amongst the parties, that there was questions as to whether or not this existed, and it was communicated before the bid process. And so Mr. Bashir shared with you the bid form. And I want to read at the top. It says, the undersigned hereby proposes to furnish all materials, equipment, labor, and supervision for the above identified project in accordance with the specifications and drawings at the following price. Now, Mr. Bashir was focused only on the number below as you add up all the different items. However, this is not simply just saying, you know, here is a scope of work or a series of scopes of work with a single price. Each one actually had a price. That is simply, the price at the bottom is simply the product of all the different scopes of work. And also, I want to mention, again, Mr. Bashir spoke about fairness. If you look at, and I apologize, it's a little bit blurry, but Division 33 is utilities, and this is where we find our work item 10, $300,000 for this particular outfall. If you take what they have presented in both their appeal process and to the board today, they've said that these $300,000 line items actually only cost them $87,000. If that's accurate, then we've got three different outfalls as part of Division 33 utilities that equal $820,000 in outfalls, of which they're saying our actual cost to do those is only $263,000, if we assume that 87 carries through for all of them. So I would just suggest to this board that if the question is basic fairness, perhaps that's not the right way of going about it, to say that we're going to spend $563,000 of unidentified cost associated with these three items here. So as we go through these, again, this is one that Mr. Bashara mentioned earlier. We know that the actual framing up in this dispute is that in April 16, 2018, they send us a letter and they say, we're not agreeing on what the deductive change order should be. What we're actually entitled to do is just deduct from our $300,000 the cost. That cost is $87,000. We did not reach agreement on that, and I think part of the reason we might not have reached agreement on that is because, as Mr. Bashara said, there were many, many additive change orders. Hal Jones has been doing work for the port for a long time. Additive change orders are not a new thing for us. This is, to my knowledge, one of the first time there's been a deductive change order. But we know that, and as referenced by Mr. Bashara, the last time they found an outfall and needed to add something to their contract price, this was on berth 5 and 6, in that time, they actually got a additive change order for a not-to-exceed amount. They estimated their cost in a January 2015 letter to JAXPORT that said, we estimate it will cost up to $225,000 to add this outfall to the project. Now, ultimately, when they went through their costs and actually did the work, it was done for $158,000. And the point only here is that, as Mr. Bashara initially said, our initial response from JAXPORT was, this is lump sum work. Even though we're not going to do any work for work item 10, even though we bid work item 10 at $300,000, you don't get an adjustment. Then after we went through it further, they said, well, actually, you get an adjustment, but it's only a deductive change order of $87,000. Notwithstanding the fact that when we add outfalls to your work, it's actually a much, much higher number. So we asked them at the in May of 2018, when they said it's $87,000 is the limits of the deductive change order, we said, please give us a breakdown of the costs. Give us a breakdown of the costs, and this is in the correspondence that was provided to the board, that actually went into your $300,000 bid amount. We don't want to look at these proxies, because these proxies apparently are widely varying and don't seem to have any relationship to each other. Well, when we asked them for the cost, Hal Jones said in response, that's unreasonable. We can't give you those costs. We can't break them down. And so what were we left to do at that point? Mr. Green signed a deductive change order that said, look, if you want to talk about true costs, we're eliminating 100% of the costs associated with work item 10. Seems reasonable to say that if you're going to eliminate 100% of the costs, you're going to eliminate 100% of the price as well. There was no work left to be done. We submitted the $300,000 deductive change order. Hal Jones did not sign that change order. They initiated the appeal process. They said they wanted to rely on their April 16, 2018 letter, which is where they say all you're entitled to is an $87,000 change. So no dispute that the work's not there. No dispute they bid $300,000. They simply say all you get back is $87,000. We still get paid $213,000 for something that we don't know what it is. As Mr. Bashara pointed out, there is separate line items for mobilization, demobilization, general conditions. There's stuff all over this contract that you say that's where things might reside. Work item number 10 is work for outfall 15 plus 52. They bid $300,000, no work is going to be done, and as stewards of public resources, we concluded that we could not pay for work that was not going to occur. As we move forward, and this is just a copy of the signed change order on the 225 when the last time they had to add an outfall. And this is the $87,000 that they had proposed to deduct. But here's the last point I want to mention. And this is something that is raised by Mr. Green, and ultimately we did send a letter terminating this portion of the contract. And it says the owner may, after written notice of the contractor, terminate the contract or a portion thereof for just cause such as a default, or, and this is key, for other reasons which are determined to be in the best interest of the owner. We exercised this partial termination clause as well. And to Mr. Bashara's point, when you're into the change order process, that's the only place in the contract where it suggests that you even engage in any kind of true cost analysis. Here, under the default and termination portion, where we exercise a partial termination for convenience, at that point, we're not into that analysis. It's simply taking work item number 10 and saying that's no longer part of the contract. And I would note this also, just again in talking about the fairness process or components of this. It was August of 2018 that Hal Jones initiated the appeal to the board process. We'd already been through the process at the CEO level. And interestingly enough, even though they never delivered us an executed change order, each and every pay application submitted monthly after that until the conclusion of this project. And these are done, signed and sworn to in front of a notary public, lists all the change orders. And change order number 15 is listed in there as an approved change order. That's the $300,000 deductive change order. So again, going to the fairness of this exercise, for approximately a 7-month process, every pay app they submitted, asked us to pay, and that we relied on in paying and actually cutting them checks for the work they were doing, they represented that the $300,000 change order was actually part of the approved change orders. So I would submit to you today that whether you get there by virtue of saying the true cost analysis under the change order process, or you get there under the the partial termination language under general condition 3.5C, the result is the same. No work is going to be performed under work item 10. The bid of that was $300,000. That's the proper amount to come out of the contract. Do I have any time left, Peggy? Any questions?
I've got one, Mr. Chairman. Gil, if that change order wasn't listed on that pay application, would we have withheld payment?
That's a hard question to answer, Mr. Fleming, only because we didn't reach that situation.
In all fairness, if it withhold their money, then I can see why they would probably have agreed to list it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been paid.
But and to the extent that I'm not aware of any conversation that said, if you don't list it, we won't pay you. They control what they put in their pay applications, and at some point, they started including a deductive change order for $300,000 after they were denied at the CEO appeal process. Any additional questions? I think Mr. Bashir used all of his time, so.
I do, if I could, yes. Some rebuttal?
I'm sorry. I guess that's at the pleasure of the board.
Okay.
I actually, if I could defer to you, Mr. Feltel, I think y'all agreed upon a format.
Yes. It'd be my position that we had agreed on 15 minutes, and if you use that on the front end,
Okay.
here we are.
There are points that were raised that I think, in all fairness, to be heard, I'd like to address, and I can do it in about 2 minutes, but
Yeah, we'll give both parties 2 more minutes, and Mr. Feltel will have an opportunity to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that.
Yes,
I do understand that we've run over on our time, but as you've indicated, it is important. I just want to address a couple of points that Mr. Feltel raised. And he indicated that there are 2 ways to address the changes. One is by change order, which we've discussed at length. The other is by partial termination, and that's where Mr. Feltel went with this. I would ask you to look in the notebooks that I've provided under the contract tab, under tab number 1, go to page GC 24, and that's where you'll find the same language that Mr. Feltel had up on the screen. And for a point of reference, he referred to this briefly as a termination for convenience, that this part of the work was terminated for the board's, for JAXPORT's convenience. Actually, that is not, there is termination for convenience in contracts. That is not what this is. These are bases for termination. And I would like to read to you the rest of that paragraph that Mr. Feltel started. As he said, the owner may, after written notice to the contractor, terminate the contract or a portion thereof for just cause, such as default or other reasons which are determined to be in the best interest of the owner. Hal Jones is not in default. They completed all of their work under the contract. Such reasons for termination may include, but are not necessarily limited to, and this gives the board an understanding as to what this contract term is for. National defense or national emergency which creates a serious shortage of materials, orders from duly constituted authorities relating to energy conservation, and restraining order or injunctions obtained by third-party citizen action resulting from national or local environmental protection laws, or where the issuance of such order or injunction is primarily caused by acts or omissions of persons or agencies other than the contractor, and unacceptable interference with operations. None of those exist. JAXPORT would be essentially making up something that doesn't exist in their contract to take away $300,000 from Hal Jones. We do not think that's consistent with the terms, or is it consistent with how JAXPORT does business. Hal Jones has always acknowledged that a credit is due to JAXPORT because of the work being reduced. And we did not bid $300,000 for that scope of work. Hal Jones bid $5.25 million for the full scope and just broke it down as we discussed further. Thank you. Unless there's any questions. Yes, sir,
Mr. Bashir, if I could take a chairman's privilege and ask you one question.
Yes, sir.
The delta between the roughly $88,000 that was reported back, which did include, I see a small amount of profit in there, and the $300,000 bid, you suggested earlier that there was other work that was included in that. Specifically, what makes up that $212,000?
So in order to determine that, you would go back to the original pricing for the bid as it was worked, because they came up with a total lump sum amount of $5.25 million. And so all of that money is for all of that work, and it's spread out over those various items. So I cannot tell you for the $300,000 because that was just an amount assigned to that line. That is not an amount that was calculated.
And not to put words in your mouth, but you're suggesting things like general overhead would have been proportionally spread out through line items?
Possibly, but not necessarily, because that is
Not
correct.
limited to general overhead, but conceptually something along that line.
That is correct, because the risk is on the contractor that if something runs over in one category, they can't go and ask for more money. And so they put in their money, and there is profit in here. And there's no question that Hal Jones expected to make a profit on this project. Not nearly as much as the 6 other contractors, perhaps, but there was enough to get the project done. But that money is spread out across those lines.
Thank you.
Mr.
Thank you.
Chairman, quickly, if I could. In this particular paragraph that you read, it does say, but are not necessarily limited to. So if that is indeed the case, does that not give us the discretion to make the decision
Dr. Newman,
in our favor as it is in our interest?
So there becomes a limit to that, in my opinion, and as a lawyer, as I would argue it to a court, and that is, when you enter into a contract, both parties have an obligation, and if the contract provides one party the opportunity to just walk away, then that's not an enforceable contract. And what that paragraph does is it gives some context to how the termination can occur. It doesn't give every reason, but it gives that it is reasons such as those, but it's not limited to those. That is not an exhaustive list, but this is the type of reason that might be there. The absence of the outfall has nothing to do with anything said in there, and it wouldn't be a basis of a termination for convenience. Further, if it were a termination of that project, I still think you have to have a change order, and that change order has to be priced so you can determine what that is, because this work is in the lump sum portion of the bid. If it were a unit price item, it would be a whole different conversation. But because it's the part of the lump sum, even if JAXPORT decides, you know what, we've run out of money, we're going to stop doing that. We can't do this anymore. So the contractor would have an opportunity then to say, okay, this is the value of the work that is left to be done that you're going to take away from me. And here's what the value is. You can't just go and say, we're just going to take the rest away. That is unfair under the contract documents, and we have to live by those contract documents, and both sides do.
So Chip, are you saying then that there is a separate nomenclature attached to, not limited to, but is actually limiting?
I do think that it gives a context. Yes,
You
sir.
see that that's not
I
consistent.
do.
right?
I see that it says it's not limited to those.
Okay, so
but
which
do-
is it limited to then?
I don't think it's unlimited. I don't think if you could terminate a contract for no reason whatsoever and just end the contract, I don't think it would be an enforceable contract. And so I think that's what you have to balance. Is just, if we were to have an agreement and I said, you're going to do this work and then I'm going to pay you for that work, and then at some point you get halfway through your work and I say, you know what, I'm not going to do that. I've decided I'm not going to do that. So I'm not going to pay you the other half of your work. And your point would be, well, wait a minute, I had to perform. And so they may say the court would indicate that there's not an enforceable contract.
Okay. Well, in the interest of time, I'll leave
I
it.
I think we're
I'll
fine.
leave it.
Unless there's a very compelling
Go ahead, yeah.
other answer. Mr. Bashir, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Mr. Feltel.
Thank you.
Briefly, Dr. Newman, I would like to actually maybe follow up on your question there.
You have my absolute permission.
Yes, sir. Mr. Bashir is speaking to the notion of an illusory contract, the idea that something that purports to be a contract promise actually is not. And I would submit to you that that's not the case here. It's not at all uncommon for public entities to reserve unto themselves the right for a partial determination, termination for convenience. And because we have separate line items, separate dollar amounts associated with it, it's very easy for us to just draw a circle around work item 10 and say, none of it's going to happen. There's nothing really for us to pay for. And in fact, actually, the termination for convenience language, it goes on to talk about the fact the contractor specifically waives any claim for lost profits associated with that. So there was a question asked to Mr. Bashira, so what else is there in that work item 10? And he said you'd have to go back to looking at what these calculations that are made on the front end. And I would just simply submit to the board for purposes of your decision today, that's exactly what we asked for back in May of 2018, and they told us it'd be unreasonable to try to give us that information. So at this point, unless there's additional questions, I would conclude my portion of the presentation and simply ask the board to render a decision upholding the positions taken by Mr. Green in his initial response to Hal Jones's appeal.
You're allowed to ask you one question.
Yes, sir.
In your original presentation, you suggested that there were two thoughts behind the deductive change order process being valid. One was Section 3.5C, if I understood that correctly.
3.5C is actually the partial termination language.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes.
So whether the board felt that that was a valid argument, and then the other you touched on a second.
Still being deductive change order that in an instance where the typical change order is, we're going to do $100 worth of work as a round number, and when we got to actually doing the work, there's a change in conditions, and we're going to do $120 worth of work, give me a change order to cover that. Here, we're never getting to the work at all. It's 100% deduction of that line item of work. Work item 10 simply, and please understand, in our correspondence, we said, tell us what you spent in figuring out that you weren't going to do work item number 10, because we'll pay you that. If you sent divers out there, if you had engineers out there investigating it, we understand that's a cost that was incurred in trying to advance the work. None of that came back. It just simply said we're going to create a proxy for what we think our cost would be. We deduct that from $300,000, and we're going to create a proxy that looks very different. A hypothetical proxy, it looks very different than when it was pay us additional money for an outfall we weren't expecting.
Right. Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
It does. Yep.
Thank you. Any additional questions? Thank you very much.
Do I hear a motion from the board in terms of taking this under consideration?
Can I have one comment first, Mr. Chairman? Getting back to your earlier point, and I've, in my career in the shipyard, I bid similar contracts that's not exactly the same for over 30 years with the Department of Defense. And I can tell you that dealing with the U.S. Navy, we submitted our bids very similar to this. There'd be line items. It's clear that if we just wanted a lump sum, we wouldn't have asked for line item prices. We just said, it's $5 million to do all this work. So it's obvious that we asked for line item prices for a reason, in case there is a change order and we want to deduct something. In their defense, and to your earlier point, I would have probably spread my overhead over all of these items. My site supervisor, some of my management folks, some of my overhead costs, I would have probably spread percentage-wise across all of these individual line items. So I could see some small amount, I don't know what their overhead cost is, it's 10%, 20%, whatever the number is. I would also ask them if we want to consider that they give us documentation to prove what their overhead costs are, which I guess they failed to do at this point. So that's the only thing that I could justify paying for, would be some of their overhead costs as a percentage of that $300,000. As far as paying them the whole thing, or the $200,000, I couldn't vote for that.
You know, Eric, would you like to?
If, probably at the risk of our legal counsel looking at me and a little cross-eyed.
If I probably could ask you to be very careful in your comments.
Just to,
Is that fair,
I
Mr.
just
Bashir?
wanted,
Bashir?
I just wanted to Mr. Fleming's point. I think our folks, staff, looked at their overhead cost, and I'm sure it's spread throughout those numbers, and Hal Jones is not a, unfamiliar contractor here at JAXPORT. And they probably know the docks a lot better than our folks do. And in fairness to them, they didn't stop work, they completed the work, but we sort of went through that, or made an attempt, as Mr. Feltel said, to, we want to enjoy a happy partnership with our partners. We understand that, because if we got a happy partner, we know the work's going to be performed accurately. And I want to say that was covered, and I would have to think that they covered themselves when they bidded on this work. So I just wanted to add that for what it's worth.
Because there is no line item for supervision in here, or
Right.
for overhead, so obviously it's spread out among all of the items.
But in fairness, as we, and a little bit more dialogue, we probably need to move forward and get the motion on the table. But, I would offer up my professional history, and with it in a totally different vertical market, obviously in commercial printing and so forth. We've responded to municipal RFPs and even corporate RFPs that we would have felt were limiting in nature. All those opportunities, such as probably this one, affords a vendor an opportunity to kind of challenge the process, ask questions ahead of time, especially probably something to this degree. And even if that did not, still, I know professionally I've been faced with scorecards and pricing opportunities such as this, and you go into it knowing that you are a great peril, right? To your point, if it's a lump sum, it's a lump sum. If they're going to break it out, then for me, I'd just look for every contingency. What is the unintended consequence of something happening or not happening? And frankly, knowing that this was not being judged per unit out of any one of those 11 or some odd, I would have loaded up in something that I was absolutely positive wasn't going to change. I don't know which one of those line items it would have been, but when you offer up these bids, you do so at your own peril. I unfortunately have been on the other side of that from time to time.
As have I.
It's a bidding strategy, is what it is. Please.
Gilly may have to help me out here, because I heard the figure 87,000 a couple times in a couple different ways. Are we saying, in our estimation, the 87,000 makes them whole?
It's a breakdown at the very back of your.
No, so the 87,000, what that refers to, and Mr. Bashir had it in his presentation, that was the avoided cost that Hal Jones provided us with their April 16, 2018 letter. So essentially, the way Hal Jones presented it was, we're entitled to $300,000 for work item 10.
Right.
Because we're not going to do it, we're only avoiding $87,000 in cost. So even though we're not going to do any work, the deductive change order should only be $87,000, and we should still be paid roughly $213,000 for that item.
I thought I heard it
Answer
a
your
couple
question?
different ways. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you much.
I'd like to entertain a motion, and at least let us move into that process. And Mr. Shelton, you leaned forward as if you had something to comment. Do you?
I'll wait till there's a motion on the table.
Sure.
Yes, sir.
Would you like to make a motion?
No.
Okay. Do I hear a motion?
Want to get it on the table, if I can articulate.
If we could, the chairman would like to entertain a motion to either approve or have it limited to either to approve or not approve the letter, and then we can offer amendments from there if appropriate.
Approving our letter to them.
Approving the CEO's response of the $300,000 change order
Well, I will so move.
to
That we
support.
support the letter that was sent by the CEO.
Okay, great. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, all those in favor? Oh, excuse me, I apologize. Let's go back into discussion and open it up for any amendments, friendly or otherwise.
Well, just let me, if it's all right if I say,
Please.
I guess we made an effort to try to get some information from them when we've asked for some backup data, which they refused to give us. I mean, I think we probably, there is some overhead costs that probably could have been paid for, but since they've turned down our request, at this point, I guess we should move on it as proposed.
Mr. Chairman, Hal Jones is another customer of mine, so I'll have to recluse myself from this vote also.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Shelton?
Oh, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I didn't mean to sound so short when I said no, I wouldn't make a motion. I didn't mean the way it sounded.
You kind of hurt my feelings.
I apologize.
I do.
You know, we were, as board members are, we are briefed ahead of time, individually on things we're going to discuss at this meetings. And we discussed this in my office several weeks back, or however long it was. And it was presented to me in a fashion very, very simple, very straightforward. And I agreed with where our position was in the chairman's letter as we have a motion on the table. Obviously, opposing counsel presents a different argument. And to me, whether or not to interpret the contract to which, we're pointing at different points, and excuse me, I couldn't find some of them. I was trying to go through the pages. I feel a little bit, and I just want to say this, and I've already determined how I'm going to vote, but I want to say this so Chip can have this, or whatever it may mean, or it may mean nothing, that at times to have something that really is a contract dispute, and unfortunately one of your board members is not an attorney, and there's lots of discussion going back and forth to decide with whose position I should agree with based on excerpts and different things, and not trying to move this along. I think there should be more time given to really study it and analyze what opposing counsel, their position of it, and ask our attorney to help me understand that better. But it sounds like there may be an avenue, possibly post this, that Mr. Bashir may have an opportunity to represent his client beyond this. I don't know if that's correct or if that's incorrect. I don't know. I don't know the judicial proceedings. But as a board member, based on the attorney that is gauged us to represent us, and based on the process that has been forwarded, and Mr. Green, our CEO's as executive, has put forth, I will be supportive of the motion to support the process and where we are at this point in time.
Any other comments?
Is this Hal Jones' last chance at remedy?
My understanding is that this is the last, this is the appropriate level of escalation under the contract, and then as with any breach of suggested, our concern about breach of contract, then there would be a, taken to the courts, and however, that threshold may dramatically change from the level of threshold that may be afforded here, if that's my understanding. So,
It's a quick question. Is it in dispute at all that there was a non-response to our request for enumeration of costs? Is that in dispute? Because I haven't heard any dispute of that.
A very brief answer to that, if you're
That's
aware of
probably a
that,
yes or no.
Counsel.
Some of this is because, for two reasons that I don't have answered. One, we're limited to time, and so I was trying to hit the high points. Was when we were asked for a breakdown of costs for that line item after the 87,000 was provided, was any specific information provided to JAXPORT by Howard Jones?
No, we gave you a breakdown as given, and asked them to respond back to that, and they never responded back to it.
Did y'all hear this? So the $87,000 breakdown was provided to JAXPORT, and then JAXPORT did not provide anything counter to that, and then there was nothing given back that says, well, here's a different calculation. And I think that there are a lot of conversations that have taken place over the last 13 months since this came about. And so I don't know that we can definitively say that there was nothing that went back and forth. I have seen, but I don't know that it was submitted, costs that Hal Jones incurred for a diver to determine whether or not the outfall was there when it was later told, we were later told it was not there. But there are some of those costs, but I'm not sure they were ever submitted. I did give them to Mr. Feltel just this past week, but I don't know that there were.
With a very brief response to that, Gil, in fairness, very brief, please.
Dr. Newman, I'm going to read, this is James Bennett writing to Mr. Paul Kirkland, who was the project manager and senior vice president for Hal Jones, May 7, 2018. This is after they gave us the $87,000 as the proxy for the costs. James asked, accordingly, please provide us with detailed data and documents relied upon by Hal Jones in submitting the $300,000 bid price for work item 10 and how those costs were determined. To be clear, we are requesting the data actually used by Hal Jones in submitting its bid and not a later created data set. And this, again, this is in your books. May 17, 2018, Hal Jones responds, and the highlighted language, JAXPORT's request that it must be provided with, quote, detailed data and documents relied upon by Hal Jones in submitting the $300,000 bid price is simply not reasonable, as this line item's documentation is not limited to supporting the outfall work as part of the $300,000 sum. So we did ask for the information. It was not provided.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Feltel. Any other conversations, specific questions? Great. We will call the question, and to restate the motion is to support the CEO letter and staff's recommendations, correct? All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? So moved. Thank you. At this point, in other business, I'll ask for a motion to approve the travel for any members of the board called upon to do business or attend meetings on behalf of the board during the months of May and June 2019.
So moved.
A second? All those in favor?
Aye.
So moved. Great. If there's no other business, seeing none, meeting is adjourned. Thank you. See, even with that, we still got 10 out of 11.